Good afternoon. Welcome to the first webinar presented by Brown Olcott. My name is Phil Brown. I'll be your presenter today. Thank you so much for joining me, first of all, and taking some time out of your lunch hour to find out what the legislature was up to this year. I do have a few announcements before we get started, and I'll hopefully give some people some time to get into the webinar. One is we'll go ahead and just take questions as we go. So if you have any questions, feel free to type them in, and I'll answer them the best I can as we go. We're going to try to do this on a quarterly basis going forward. So please look for your emails from our office regarding upcoming webinars. And I do have one announcement. As many know, I'm on the board for CAI Southern Arizona. And we are having an expo this year. October 3rd is the date of the expo. So we'll have booths and vendors, as well as some educational sessions and a legal forum at that time. So please mark the date for that expo in the fall. Today I'll just basically be following the outline. Hopefully everyone was able to download the outline, the legislative update that we've provided for 2014, and I'll be following that and basically giving some tips and pointers on the new law, as well as answering any questions that you have. So overall, I think this year was not too bad of a year for the legislature. They didn't do too much to really hurt the industry, as I think they've done sometimes in previous years, and they actually have a few bills that I think are going to be really helpful this time. And the first is email, voting by email and fax delivery. What's really nice, this was implied in the law prior, the prior changes, and now they've made it explicit that email voting is fine. I like to use an official address that's provided by the owner so that the association has a record of what that official email address is, and when they receive email from that address, they can consider it a valid email. And I do recommend, or we do recommend, using the original ballot in emails rather than simply voting in the body of the email. Much prefer to have them scan the ballot to a PDF and then email that PDF to the association as far as voting goes. The reason being is that we do get requests from members in the future. If there's a contested election, we want to be able to just print out that ballot separately and not have to provide the email. Which reminds me, is the email now an official record of the association that has to be disclosed on request? I would say yes. If we have that form that's filled out, it says this is my official email, and a member asks for that email, in my opinion, then it is an official record of the association and should be disclosed. For those that don't have email or haven't provided the association with an official email, then we do have to still send out the absentee ballots for all owners. And I do have a question: do all the board members and or owners that are eligible to vote in a specific issue have to respond? The answer to that is no. No one is required to vote. We certainly hope that they vote, but no one is required to vote in any election. And for voting, online services are already popping up. I know there is one called Vote Now, or Vote HOA Now, or it could be Vote Now HOA that I've heard about. And these will be great services for bigger communities where the website service actually takes control of making sure those ballots are validated and making sure that everything is kosher with respect to the membership that is voting. So please look for more sites and more services that will be provided that do allow for the email voting in a really nice way. And that'll be helpful for surveys as well. There was quite a bit on rental property in the omnibus bill. and some of it I think is really helpful. One, it clarifies that an amendment to the declaration will be required, and I think this was already the case in the law, but it clarifies that if you want to limit rentals to a percentage or to a number or prohibit them altogether, then that's going to have to be in the declaration. You can't just pass a rule or a resolution limiting rental properties. And property owners do have to abide by those limits, so the investor can't ignore those limits and rent the property. An association as well may deal with a designated agent. It's not required to deal with that agent, but I certainly think it's helpful with investor owners. If they have an agent, that agent's likely to be more responsive than the owner, and so many times they end up directing the association back to the agent. And so I think that's really helpful, and it makes it clear that the association can deal with the agent rather than having to try to reach that investor owner who may be these days usually in Canada somewhere. So it makes it also clear that the agent is still not an owner and can't serve on the board. So if an agent tries to do that, just say no. The omnibus bill does limit quite a bit what an association may ask for, what type of information an association may ask for from that owner. And it's the adult contact information, the terms of the lease, which is relevant when you have restrictions, minimum 30 days or minimum 6-month lease terms. Those terms are still valid and enforceable. And of course the vehicles that are in the vehicles, the make, model, license plate of the vehicles, so that we can regulate the parking in the community. Associations, if you're an over 55 community, you can still require proof that at least one resident's over 55, and so that's no problem there. Now the question is, well, can you ask the tenant for copies of information other than the lease, other than the contact information, the lease term, etc.? And I would say yes in certain instances. One that comes to mind is our pets. The association has an interest in keeping track of whose pets are whose in the community. I certainly don't have any objection to the association asking the tenant what their pets are, so that we can, especially if there are no pets allowed, but particularly if we're having problems with pets in the community. When we start asking for additional information from the tenant, the problem occurs. Well, what happens if the tenant refuses to give that information? Well, that's a big problem, because now you have to go back to the owner. So enforceability against the tenant, in my opinion, is still very weak or non-existent, other than, as we'll get to later, when a crime is committed. We have another question. Can we ask for an emergency contact number? Yeah, I have no problem asking for an emergency contact number from the tenant. It's completely reasonable. Why they wouldn't want to give you an emergency contact, I don't know, but I think that, it may fall under the adult contacts in the statute as well. It says name and contact information for any adults occupying the property. So I think that emergency contact would certainly quite reasonably fall under that part of the statute. And the statute goes on to make clear that the investors must be allowed to serve on the board. I know this does come up now and then, and that we have a lot of investors who some are in other parts of the country, and there's always movements to keep those investors from being able to run and being able to serve on the board, and the statute makes it clear that you cannot do that. It was true before the statute. It's just now it's been clarified. Unfortunately, I think the legislature really failed us when we start talking about the penalties involved when an owner fails to comply with this minimal information. The fine is capped at $15 for incomplete or late information. I've already been asked a couple times, well, what if they don't provide the information at all? There is an argument that you could impose an additional fine, but I don't really like that argument because other parts of the statute penalize the association for asking for treating a tenant or an investor owner any differently than an owner-occupied owner. So I still think that the fine would be capped at $15 if they don't provide that information at all. I'd imagine there'll be some clarification on that. Is it 15 per year or per lifetime? Well, I would say it's 15 per lease term was the question. There was a question, sorry. Is the fine $15 per year per lifetime? I'd say for the term of that lease. So until the next lessee moves in, I would say that all you can charge is the $15 fine, which is really nothing. And the statute unfortunately goes on to cap the administrative fee at $25, which again is not very helpful for the association. I do think it's a lot more than $25 worth of work goes into updating that information and keeping track of the tenants, keeping track of the owner investors. So it may be, I do think the associations, at least some associations, will be tempted to simply ignore the statute and say, well, we can't fine them and we can't charge the fee, but we really do need to get this information. So we'll see what happens as this plays out over the next year or two. Who gets charged, and another question, who gets charged the $25, the HOA or the investor? Rather pay the $15 versus $25. Well, the fine is $15 is charged against the investor owner. The $25 is paid as an administrative fee for essentially monitoring the tenant. So that would go typically to the management company if there is one, or to the association if there's not. It's not written into the statute exactly who gets that, but I would assume that it would go to whoever's doing the work. So I think a management company, if they want to be careful and clarify, they would just write that right into their agreements with the association, that $25 fee goes to the management company. And again, any attempt to circumvent the statute renders the fines unenforceable, and you can't ask for the information, or you can ask for it, but the owner is no longer obligated to provide it for you. So unfortunately, the new legislation is really, as we can see, it has a strong property manager and realtor association bias. So we do have another question. Well, how are we going to get the tenants' contact information, and if there is an emergency situation you're unable to contact, will the association management company be liable? Well, I would say no. If they're unwilling to provide contact information, and the statute requires it, then I don't see how they could turn around and say that the association or the management company is liable for not being able to reach that tenant in an emergency. The rights involved in entering a property in emergency, things like of that nature. Say there's a water leak and you have to enter the unit, those rights still exist. So this statute doesn't really affect the rights in the declaration as far as the rights of entry in a case of emergency. So you should be aware of that. This is just getting that basic information from the investor owner for the purpose of trying to keep track of who's actually living in your community. One thing it does do is it does hurt any efforts by the association to use a crime-free lease addendum. Again, this goes back to the enforceability. So an owner can use a crime-free addendum, but the association can't require the owner to use a crime-free lease addendum. So, and these crime-free lease addendums, for those that don't know, are simply promises by the tenant and the owner that the crimes are not going to be committed on the property during the terms of the lease. So these have been effective tools for keeping criminals out of associations, particularly condominiums. But as we'll see a little bit later, there is some help there that's provided by the legislature to answer this question about, well, we can't do the crime-free addendum, but the association does have a right now to take action against that tenant and the owner and the agent in the event of crimes are being committed on the property. And I'll discuss that a little bit later on. So we're moving away from the tenant information for just a little bit. One thing that has been changed is the Office of Administrative Hearings. This office was set up a few years ago, and as we all know, it hasn't been the most effective office that's ever been created, but it certainly does help in that fact that we can get injunctions for a little bit less now than we were having to pay when we had to go into Superior Court every time to try to get that injunction. So it is helpful in that respect. And one thing it has done is it added this provision regarding the fee, and the owner who brings a charge against the association can get their fee returned if they settle or dismiss before a hearing. And I think this is helpful on balance because it encourages settlement, and it encourages the fee is pretty hefty. I believe it's $500 or maybe even more than that, maybe $700. So the fee is pretty hefty for that owner, and to have the opportunity to get the fee back in the event of settlement, I think really does help. Now, of course, there will be those awful owners, which I think will be the exception, that just bring these as a nuisance kind of action and just dismiss them voluntarily just to kind of annoy the association. But I think that's unlikely to happen very often. One issue that I see, this condo provision that the legislature came up with as far as for political signs, I don't see it being very smart in that if we're touching limited common elements, what if we can't prohibit the owners from putting up their signs and whatnot. However, if they cause damage to those limited common elements, now we have to deal with getting them to repair the damage. So I don't particularly like this political signs statute, but it does provide, like it or not, that an owner can put up. So if they want to put up 9 1-foot square signs, they can do that. If they want to put them on their patio or something to that effect, then there's nothing the association can do unless there happens to be a municipal ordinance that would limit the number to something less than 9. So we will have to get familiar with all of the different sign laws in the municipalities with respect to political signs to see how the association can limit the use of the number and size of those signs. And hopefully it won't be too much of a problem. Of course, again, this will, in condos, and this statute only applies to condos. The problem that I see is the aggressive use of this statute for the overly politically active, and trying to regulate the use of those signs, I think, is going to be a huge challenge to the association. Now, there are a couple of helpful provisions. One is that the same restrictions apply with respect to the days before and days after the election. So 71 days before and 71 days before the election and 3 days after, the association can regulate those signs. So those signs, 3 days after the election, they need to come down. And we've had a couple of questions about whether or not this applies to elections within the association. And I don't see anything in the statute that prohibits people from using political signs when they're running for office within the association or in support of someone running for office within the association. So I do think it applies to any local issues within the community, that if there's an upcoming vote on an amendment, anything along that nature, I do think the statute applies. And I don't think that the association will be able to successfully enforce against any particular owner during the relevant time period to force them to take down that sign. And again, it can't be more restrictive than the local ordinance. So if there is no local ordinance, then you're limited to the 9 square feet as part of the statute. That's pretty much the only regulation that's allowed if there is no local ordinance. The legislature also clarified a couple of areas of law, as well as expanded the use, or the availability, I should say, of the use of small claims court. And I like the first part of the statute much better than the second, not just for my own self-interest, but for the interest of the association. So the first part of the statute does clarify that the employee or the manager can record liens for the association as long as it's part of the management agreement and you have a certified legal document preparer preparing those documents for the association. And this isn't a big change from what's already been happening in the industry. A lot of, especially the bigger management companies, have been using certified legal document preparers to prepare and record liens. Now, there is a statutory provision, 33-420, that provides a fairly large penalty for a mistake, which is $5,000 statutory penalty. So it is important that those liens be properly prepared and recorded. Especially where these usually happen is there's a sale coming up and a lien is recorded. That causes problems, especially if the person made the payment. Say the person makes the payment on Monday, it doesn't get into the books of the association for a few days, and in that time the association's recorded a lien. Then they could have some statutory liability under that scenario. Again, it's something that certified legal document preparers do have some training in this area, and as long as your software is good and you're managing payments promptly, it shouldn't be too much of a problem. The second part of the statute involves managers representing the association in small claims, and I personally think this is not a good idea for the manager or the association, especially if they're defending the association. So if someone brings a complaint against the association in small claims, I don't know if I'd want to be the manager that has to go in there and defend that claim. Yes, it is small claims, and the amounts involved aren't great. However, the legislature doesn't require any type of training or anything else from that manager to go in and represent the association. So I do get that it's a nice source of revenue for management companies, and I certainly don't blame any manager that wants to do this. However, if even in our office, problems occur all of the time, and that's a tough conversation to have with your board if something goes wrong. But you certainly have the right to do it, and I would think that it's not in the best interest of the association to have, particularly on the defense side, to have managers defending the association. There are a couple of areas where I don't think it's going to really affect the industry at all as far as what the legislature's decided to do here. The legislature decided that, well, planned communities can't be required as part of the approval process for a new community. However, the developers certainly can and certainly will continue to set up planned communities as part of the development. Why? Because they want to have a nice development, right? They want to have those restrictions because, for the most part, people like living in planned communities, and the reason being is that people can't work on their cars in the front yard and have to keep their lawn a certain way, and developers want to maximize their revenue, and one way to do that is to set up those restrictions properly. So I don't think this will have a big effect on anyone. Any good developer, I think, is going to want to have those restrictions, and certainly going to want to have a nice community for people to live in. And again, this is getting back to this nuisance issue. The nuisance, this was part of the omnibus bill, and so the legislature took away the crime-free lease addendum, but they added this provision, which I think is really helpful in that we finally get some direction about being able to sue tenants directly, and I think this will be a huge help for those problem tenants. It says owner, agent, or responsible party. Now, why they didn't just say owner, agent, tenant, or other responsible party, or resident, or other responsible party, I don't know. But it seems to me that the intent of the statute is to allow the association to go after problem tenants directly. And if something like this would come into our office, I think I'd probably sue all of them. If there's an owner and there's an agent and a tenant, get them all on the hook, and so they can't point fingers at each other. But finally, we at least get some authority to go directly after those tenants. And the issue is nuisance abatement. And the legislature was careful to define it as residential property that is regularly used in the commission of a crime is a nuisance. The criminal activity causing the nuisance shall be enjoined, abated, and prevented. So, are allowed parties crimes? Yes. Are playing music too loud? Yes. Now, it'll be interesting how this plays out in the family law kind of domestic violence arena, but it's certainly use in the commission of a crime. So we'll see what happens, but I do like the fact that at least the HOA has something to use to try to control that problem tenant. Since we no longer really have the crime-free lease addendum in the way that we did prior to this new language. And I should mention, I did forget to mention that all of the new statutes go into effect on July 24th, 2014. I need to pause just to get a quick drink of water here. All right. So transfer fees. We know this has come up, and you know what? I think it's going to come up again. The legislature I've probably get one call a week on this transfer fee issue, and so I'm kind of glad that the legislature did this, at least to clarify what's a transfer and what's not, or at least to try to. Essentially, interfamily transfers are going to be exempt from those fees. So if it's parent to child, husband adds his wife, grandparent to grandchild, natural siblings, things like that, then the association isn't going to be able to charge the transfer fee. As well as transfers, essentially estate planning transfers, transfers between commonly controlled entities, so a member to an LLC controlled by that member isn't going to be subject to a fee. One thing that wasn't covered that I at least directly was foreclosures. It would have been nice to clarify if a property is transferred pursuant to a foreclosure sale, can the fee be charged? Can it be charged to the new owner? How exactly is that going to work? So I think it is covered if there's a foreclosure where it transfers back to the bank. One part of the statute says from a trust beneficiary to its trustee, or a trustee to its trust beneficiary. So that may be covered, but when someone purchases a home at a foreclosure sale, whether or not it's covered is an open question that hopefully they'll come back in the future and clarify that for us. And it does finally give at least a little bit of help to the association on these when a transfer doesn't go through the title company, there is an onus on the owner to provide the association with the change in ownership and the member information. Now, if they don't provide it, there's no penalty on that owner, but at least we can point to the statute and say, look, you're responsible for providing this information to us, and I'd imagine that most owners would be happy to. And one other thing they did, which I think is very helpful, is do away with this property owners associations. Property owner associations exist typically in the rural areas where there are huge tracts of lots, and all there are really roads that cut through those common areas. And all the association does is maintain those roads. Usually once a year they get a grader and scrape the road clear, and they really don't have any other function. They don't own any property. The lot lines either go to the middle of the road, or the roads simply just cut right through certain lots. And before, the property owners associations were not subject to the Planned Community Act, meaning that we'd have to fall back on the Nonprofit Corporations Act. Proxies were allowed. A lot of the disclosure and open meeting requirements did not apply to property owners associations, and I think it just causes a lot of confusion. I got an attorney letter last week from a property owners association citing to the Planned Community Act, and had to let them know, well, it doesn't apply. So now the answer will be, well, it does apply, and all property owners associations are subject to the Planned Community Act, and I think that's going to be really helpful, and that'll provide some consistency throughout the state with respect to how these associations are managed and governed. So again, it'll be a huge impact on rural communities. I don't know of many property owners associations within cities. So that's about it. Are there any other questions? Regarding information collected by the HOA Board of Directors from tenants/renters, does this information become public to be shared with other HOA residents upon request, or is the information considered confidential? That's a good question. I don't see that it's personal financial information or it falls within any of the exceptions to the disclosure that's found in 33-1805. So yes, and it is an association record, so in my opinion, that information should be disclosed, the names and the lease term and the adult contact name. So yes, it should be public with respect to if a member requests that information, it will have to be disclosed. Well, thank you so much for joining me and taking time out of your day to learn a little bit about what the legislature is up to. Again, all of these laws will be effective July 24th of this year, and again, please look for future webinars. We may hit different topics, enforcement, board training, collections, things like that. So